Welcome back to Comic Krackle. I'm your host. If you grew up in the early 2000s like myself, you probably have a clearer memory of the first time that you saw Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies than you do 9/11. At the time, Spider-Man took the cultural consciousness by storm. Not that one. I believe that American culture was looking for an idol during a time of disillusionment with the government as well as mass media, but that's a video for another day. While Fox's X-Men franchise is typically cited for the inception of the trend of superhero films, and Blade is credited for telling adult-oriented stories, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was just different. It dared to go where others stumbled, allowing the comic book hero to don a semi-accurate costume from their comic book counterpart. What a novel concept! No overly muted palettes, no leather jackets because of the popularity from The Matrix. Just a red and blue cloth suit made by a teenager that just happened to know something about sewing and fashion.
That's a cute outfit.
With the primary influences stemming from Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita Sr.'s run on the character, it took those runs as inspiration and adapted those core concepts for a modern audience. It allowed for the character and the supporting characters to be looked at in this evergreen approach, and that lent for a timeless nature for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Much like the reaction to the first appearance of the character in Amazing Fantasy 15, a younger demographic could envision themselves to be the character. With minimal adaptations focusing on younger characters that weren't sidelined to be a sidekick, younger audiences could envision themselves to be Peter Parker, and they empathized with Peter Parker. After Spider-Man debuted in 2002, with a worldwide box office of $825 million, Marvel Comics made the concerted effort to target these new incoming fans with Evergreen Stories depicting the core concepts for the characters. Today's installment is talking about just one of those series that came out of this initiative, and how this comic series could possibly have inadvertently influenced Spider-Man 3. But before we get into that, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Spider-Man Dr. Octopus Negative Exposure was written by Brian K. Vaughan with art by Staz Johnson. As spoken about in the previous video discussing Y the Last Man, go watch that next. Brian K. Vaughan made his break into the comic book industry when he was still a student studying film at NYU. He was 19 when he was first published by the company, and at the time of this series releasing, he had 6 years under his belt of being published by Marvel Comics. During the early aughts, Vaughan was beginning to make a name for himself and building towards where we know him to be today. Prior to the series publication, Vaughan had works published such as Icon's Chamber, Icon's Cyclops, and various minimal works. Vaughan had other books that were currently in development but hadn't released at time of publication, including his hit series Runaways and Marvel Max's The Hood. He was also starting to get traction with his Y the Last Man series published under DC's Vertigo imprint. This is all to say that Brian wasn't the fully formed version of himself that we know today, but he was beginning to get traction in the industry. Staz Johnson, on the other hand, was no beginner when this series was published. He had previous works published under DC, doing Detective Comics, Robin, and Catwoman, as well as 2000 AD's Judge Dredd and Rogue Trooper. The series came together for the highly anticipated and then later dearly beloved Spider-Man 2. The story introduces us to a new player at the Daily Bugle named Jeffrey Haight. Get it? Haight? Somebody get this guy an Eisner. Jeffrey's a photographer at the Daily Bugle, but he's seemingly always a runner-up to Peter Parker when it comes to the publication of their photos into the paper. Jeffrey begins to form this sort of envy for Peter Parker, as he doesn't understand why Peter is published over his own work, and how Peter is naturally gifted in the art of photography, almost effortlessly. His envy later turns to hatred as he equates his self-worth with being published in the paper. Jeffrey quickly devolves into stalking Peter to find out how Peter has this idealistic life that he pines for. A bit of Jeffrey's character is interesting. He's never satisfied with the achievements and always explains away his shortcomings, almost as if it's never his fault. He has a relationship with a police officer named Anne, who gives him insights into the current crimes occurring, but at every turn, he's rejecting affection from her. He's insistent to refer to their relationship as one of convenience. However, throughout the story, she's startled at his rejection of her affection. Now, this could be the representation of the consumption of hatred and envy, but I don't think it's that easy. Possibly it could be a reflection of a comic creator's desire for greatness, and any accolades achieved are just seen as participation trophies. With that, we would come to the assumption that Jeff is the manifestation of envy between creators. Jeff hates Peter because Peter is effortlessly achieving his goals, and Jeff comes to the conclusion that Peter is unworthy of these accomplishments. Now, in relation to the comic book industry, this could embody the accolades that are given to creators that other creators think that they don't deserve. Like I mentioned earlier, Vaughan was recruited by editorial to work for Marvel while he was a student at NYU. So realistically, it could be shown in two different perspectives. Either Vaughan could see himself as Peter, effortlessly gliding through the accolades and getting stories without the need for paying of dues, or it could be that Vaughan sees himself as Jeffrey. He studied film at NYU, so there's a possibility that he thinks that he has a firmer grasp on storytelling compared to his contemporaries. Maybe he doesn't understand why other creators are given these accolades when he can pinpoint the flaws in other creators' stories. Maybe I'm just looking into it too much, but it's my channel, and I'll be damned if I don't indulge in my diatribes. Anyways, back to the story. So Jeff is offered an opportunity to interview Dr. Octopus at Rikers Island. And of course, Otto puts on the act of being a giant fan of the photographer. Otto laments Jeff in his artistry, and he plays to his ego in an attempt to form a relationship to help with his maniacal machinations. Doc Ock's scheme leads Jeff to be an accomplice in his escape from Rikers Island, and leads to a supposed final altercation with Spider-Man. All the while, Jeff's perspective shows this degenerative and paranoia-riddled response as a result of wanting to usurp Peter Parker from the unworthy throne of being published by the Daily Bugle. Jeff hopes to capture the moment that Doc Ock strikes the final blow, killing Spider-Man. Well, that doesn't happen, and Spider-Man beats the bad guy, end of story. Who could have guessed? The series takes place in the Lee Romita years, as it refers to Peter's relationship with Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy, and also cementing that Peter was a student at Empire State University. This differs from the main line of comics that were being published at the same time, as J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr.'s run had Peter Parker as a teacher at Empire State University and significantly older. This time displacement is used as a means to provide synergy with the movies and the comics, as well as telling an evergreen story to invite the fans of the adaptation to start reading Spider-Man comics. The costume for Doc Ock changes between issues 1 and 2, at first being more in line with his standard fare of costume, and later transitioning into what he wore in Spider-Man 2. Yes, I know he's wearing a trench coat in it. It was just for a joke at the beginning. It's even acknowledged within the pages as Spider-Man states, "If I were you, I'd dream about firing your fashion consultant. Your new look is actually worse than your old bowl cut and jumpsuit ensemble. I mean, is that jacket supposed to be hip? Or, so it's a story that's fit for new audiences who are semi-aware of the characters, while also showing a story devoid of the current continuity at the time. The series is innocuous in its simplicity. I mean, realistically, it could be boiled down to an Eddie Brock archetype that isn't given the power to take on both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. The story could have influenced the depiction of Eddie Brock within Spider-Man 3 by consolidating the plot points for Eddie Brock and his spiral towards Venom. I mean, Spider-Man 3 omits the plot beats of having Eddie Brock wrongfully out the Sin Eater, which leads to the death of Jean DeWolf, and Eddie is no longer a reliable news reporter. The film could have taken inspiration with the series by just having Eddie Brock be a rival photographer, and then later incorporating the plot beats of hating Spider-Man. Because I know it's been widely talked about, but Venom wasn't originally intended to be in Spider-Man 3 and was really just a push from Sony and specifically Avi Arad because Venom's a fan favorite character. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but it's definitely not outside of the realm of possibility. Okay, if I'm being honest, the story was just fine. Narratively, I see glimmers of what Vaughan would be in the future, but it's not necessarily his strongest work. The characters are written well, and it doesn't meander in its pacing. A common signifier in Bryan's work is focusing on characterization and delving into the psyche of the leading roles. Although it's billed as a Spider-Man series, Peter plays really a supporting role. The focus being on this newly created character is earned, and it manages to achieve what it set out to do. Artistically, I feel like Staz Johnson was forced by editorial or the powers that be to emulate Mark Bagley and J. Scott Campbell's art. It's almost distracting in some areas, as I would see pencils rendered in a specific fashion that I could realistically think that Mark Bagley would do better work on, and that it wasn't really indicative of what I know Staz Johnson to typically do. Stories like these benefit the most from stylization. I mean, just look at the majority of Tim Sale's work, be it Superman for All Seasons, Batman The Long Halloween, Spider-Man Blue. Choosing creators based on what's publishing at the time and not based on what they do for their work would inhibit the creative process. But if you're targeting a new audience, why are we making artists adapt to what's selling at the time? It's not only putting a shelf life on the series, but it's also dating the time of publication. Okay, now I can go into the real reason that I chose this series. Evergreen Stories. Similar to the Superman Kryptonite video that I made previously, an evergreen story does not ask much of the reader, and it can be handed to mass audiences. It utilizes the varying knowledge, but holds true to the character's core concepts. These concepts are practically learned through osmosis through the cultural consciousness. I mean, there's endless debate online about entry points for comics. Some state that the comic book industry is impenetrable due to continuity and not a lot of on-ramps for new readers. Personally, I don't subscribe to this way of thinking because I started reading comics when I was like 8 years old, and I would make $20 every other week mowing lawns, and I would take that and I would buy as many Spider-Man and Daredevil issues from the dollar bin that I could get my grubby little hands on. I would read those issues until the staples fell out. The alternate perspective is also somewhat flawed. Imagine trying to read Crisis on Infinite Earths with no concept other than the Super Friends. There needs to be a differentiation between writing for an existing audience and trying to entice new readers. What I do find interesting is Marvel's reluctance in incorporating just some of these publication practices to synergize with the MCU's success. It's seldom that Marvel is publishing evergreen stories in the modern day, and typically the limited series that they've been publishing fall within two camps. Either it's in a distinct alternate universe timeline, or it's the revisiting of a character from a writer that wrote them previously. Specifically with Ann Nocenti for Storm and Captain Marvel, D.G. Chichester for Daredevil, and Peter David for Spider-Man. If you listen to my interview with Ram V, holy shit, I can't believe that's a real sentence, we spoke about nostalgia leading writing and publishing practices within modern comics, and elaborated on the detrimental impact that this will have for attaining new audiences. I wanted to talk about this series in particular because I feel like Evergreen Stories are a lost art form in the wake of the MCU and a post-Hickman comic book industry. Hickman proved that wide-sprawling epics could sell, so creators rushed to tell their version of what Hickman did. What we see in the aftermath is successes being few and far between. The reason that Ryan North's Fantastic Four run is dearly beloved is because it's condensed storytelling focusing on characters. We're not doing wide-sprawling epics, it's giving an on-ramp for new audiences and old audiences to enjoy it. DC has been incorporating just some of these practices within their initiatives, specifically at Dawn of DC, offering an on-ramp for new readers, as well as focusing in on the scope of story. They're also utilizing previously unaware audiences of the industry with their compact collections, taking stories that can be self-contained and an entry point and making the barrier to entry $9.99. Marvel, on the other hand, has been increasingly synergistic with the MCU, while also not providing any entryways for movie fans to make their way over to being comic fans. I mean, for Kirby's sake, if you go and try to find one of their trades, they're selling those trades for more money than it would take to buy those individual issues. I mean, it's realistically like what, 5 or less issues that they're putting into a trade, and then they're charging $25 each? That is too much of a barrier to entry for these new readers when you can get the entirety of Watchmen, All-Star Superman, Batman Court of Owls for $9.99, and those are self-contained stories. Why would I get their first trade of a character that I happen to like the adaptation on for $25 when I can just go and buy a Batman book, a Wonder Woman book, a Superman book for $9.99, and really I could get all three for the cost of one trade at Marvel. Marvel has a problem, and it's that they expect the audiences from the MCU to transfer to comic sales. That's not happening. If you chase the fans of adaptations and neglect the fans of comics, you're going to lose the audience that you thought you would retain. This is in no way to put blame on the creators for the books published or the quality of the work, because it's not their problem. It's editorial and a publisher not focusing on new audiences while also retaining the other audiences. They're supposed to be the ones that implement the initiatives, and in my honest opinion, the majority of the successes have been from initiatives spawned by creators. Jonathan Hickman was the architect for both the Krakoa era of X-Men and the new Ultimate Universe. Chip Zdarsky attempted to do two different initiatives, one with Life Story and the other with a revival of What If. But when Marvel didn't see instant success, they canceled them and went with the status quo. Marvel is terrified and they're experiencing another bankruptcy. The first was financial, and now it's intellectual. If they solely rely on the creators and provide no support, what incentivizes them to stay? You know what? Maybe Kirkman was right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really had a blast formulating just some of my thoughts into this video. It might be a little long-winded and it might run for a longer time than I was expecting, but I think it's a poignant conversation that needs to be had. We need to offer evergreen stories for new audiences and not just force in synergy. I mean, I was specifically talking about Kamala Khan becoming a mutant. Anyways, this series was a lot of fun to read because it's cool to see creators aren't fully formed at inception, and it takes time to build to where they are today. If you're watching this far, I think you might like the video that's over on the left. It's covering Marvel stuff. I know I haven't done enough Marvel things recently. I'll fix it soon. And click the button on the right to subscribe to the channel. Like the video, comment down below what you want to see in the future. You know, all the good shit. Anyways, that's all for me. Go read some comics. Or else.